Rules Committee to come to order, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. Tonight, the Rules Committee will consider the conference report to accompany H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018, and H.R. 2874, the 21st Century Flood Reform Act. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018 is the primary legislative vehicle driven through Congress by Congressman Chairman Mac Thornberry of Clarendon, Texas. And I think this will help Congress to advance the vital funding that authorizes America's great military requirements. This final conference report provides all branches of the military with the resources and the supplies necessary to fulfilling their many responsibilities. This legislation supports funds for the base budget requirements of $634.2 billion, provides a 2.4% pay increase for troops, fully funds $8 billion for cyber operations, and provides $4 billion to support missile defense enhancements to counter the North Korean threat. The legislation further streamlines bureaucracies, drives efficiencies through competition, and gives the Pentagon the tools that the chairman and I believe ranking member believe are necessary to make better business decisions. At a time of increased threats throughout the world, the NDAA strives to ensure that our military forces are agile, efficient, ready, and lethal. I commend the Armed Services Committee, both the ranking member and the young chairman, for their tireless work to ensure our servicemen and women have the training and necessary support to accomplish their mission. The committee will also consider the 21st Century Flood Reform Act. To supplement the availability of flood insurance in the private market, Congress in 1968 created the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, 50 years later, the federal program has a monopoly, and it has borrowed over $30 billion from taxpayers. It operates on a $1.4 billion annual deficit, and I believe lacks the innovation and necessary information that would be expected of any company with a $1.2 trillion insurance coverage. H.R. 2874 provides much-needed reforms to ensure the NFIP is financially sustainable, enhances incentives and approaches to reduce further flood damages and vulnerabilities, and ensures that a greater portion of premiums are collected and they're available to pay claims that ultimately reduce and better protection for taxpayers. Without objection, I'd like to welcome first the chairman and the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, and to thank both of them not only for their stellar work of working with each other, but also working to ensure that the conference was successful to bring back a product that I believe that the House not only can vote on, the Senate can pass, and the President of the United States will sign. Gentlemen, you've both done long hours, great service to not only the United States military, but I think for freedom and to protect the American people, and I'm very proud of you. So without objection, anything you brought in writing today will make an order, and we look forward to your testimony. Before I go any further, however, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Florida, the ranking member, for any opening comment he'd like to make. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to associate myself with your remarks regarding our presenters and colleagues and the extraordinary work that they do on behalf of all of us and the nation. I have nothing further at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Judge Hastings. Gentlemen, both of you have been subject to a good bit of feedback, not just from myself, but I know other members. As our approach, you stood steadfast, you worked together. It's my understanding that both of you signed the conference report, which says volumes about both of you, not just the leadership that the young chairman provides. Mr. Smith, I want to thank you for your steadfast resolve, as you always have throughout the years that I've known you, for the men and women of the military. This last weekend, I had an opportunity to join with so many other people in Dallas, Texas, and in North Texas to thank our veterans, to thank the men and women from years past up to today, the Gold Star mothers, the many people who have sacrificed, the families, the children, and that is so true today. It's true today that what you've done with this work and Mr. Thornberry have updated, made better, and provided cover for yet another year. I appreciate you. The gentleman from Clarendon, Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I am very pleased, along with the ranking member, to be back before you with a conference report on defense authorization bill. I want to kind of group my comments into a couple of summaries of the bill, one procedural and one substantive, because you folks, the Rules Committee, have been a key part of the procedural part of this that has enabled not only all the members of this committee, but many of the members of the House to contribute to the conference report that we are bringing back before you. Now, what that means is nobody likes everything in it. I don't. I would do things differently, but it is the product of a process that I'd like to just briefly describe. This bill was considered in our committee. 231 amendments were adopted. 116 of them were sponsored by Democratic members of the committee, 115 by Republicans, and it passed the committee by a vote of 60-1. Thanks to the good work of the House Rules Committee, 210 amendments were made in order on the House floor. 106 of them were sponsored by Democratic members, 104 of them by Republican members. It passed the House by a vote of 344-81. A similar Senate version passed by a vote of 89-8, and so we went into conference with 684 House provisions and 692 Senate provisions. We come back to you, of course some of them were similar. We come back to you with a conference report of 772 provisions, virtually all of which relate directly to national security, which is a nice thing. Of the conference committee, 26 out of 27 Senate conferees signed the conference report. In the House, 29 out of 31 core conferees signed and 32 out of 42 outside conferees signed. My point is that this is the sort of regular process most of us learn about in our civics books, and I think it is important to send a message to the men and women who risk their lives for us that the institution of the Congress is functioning and supports them when they are risking their lives. I think it's also important to send a message to the world, adversaries and allies alike, that whatever differences we may have on taxes or other issues, we stand with the men and women who serve in our military and are willing to stand up and defend ourselves when threatened. So I think process matters, and I just want to especially take a moment to thank the Rules Committee for what you have done in enabling that process all through the system. Secondly, just briefly, summary of the substance of the matter. Mr. Chairman, your summary started out with the most important thing, and that is our people. As you mentioned, we have the full pay raise that the statute says our troops should have. We do not have a cut in their housing allowance. We make permanent the survivors benefit program payments that currently exist, known as the widow's tax. It was to expire next spring. We were able to not only continue those payments, but continue them in perpetuity. We ensure the quality of health care overseas for our service members, and there were some real issues we discovered when some military hospitals were closing and the service members were going to be relegated to the local institutions. I want to mention one other relatively small item, but it's often said you recruit a soldier, but you retain a family. One of the things we do is we help spouses meet the expenses of licensing or certification requirements as they are required to move from state to state. Most spouses these days work. And if you're a nurse, if you're a teacher, or all of these other professions, you got to start over every 2 years. I would like for the governors to have some sort of reciprocity. We can't do that, but what we can do is help meet some of the expenses of having to reapply for your nursing license or so it's a small thing, but it also goes to this issue of families. I'd say other than people, the second most important thing is readiness. We have $26 billion above the president's request to make sure that the equipment we have is in good repair and that our troops are trained. Y'all know, and Adam and I have received briefings on the recent accidents in the Pacific that are very disturbing. The Air Force recently said that they're not 1,500 pilots short, they're 2,000 pilots short. 60% of the F-18s in the Navy and Marine Corps cannot fly today because they lack maintenance and spare parts. We've got to rebuild our military. Third, I would say missile defense. We end up being about $4 billion above the president's original request, and we include more ground-based interceptors that help protect our homeland, as well as more interceptors for Patriot, THAAD, and other systems. And we also fully support the request for the Israeli missile defense systems, which we work on together with them and benefit both of us. We have a number of reforms, cut in bureaucracy. One of the I think most significant is space reform. Space is a domain of warfare. We did not quite do everything that the House-passed bill does on space, but we do a lot to help ensure that we have better management of that critical domain. And I just want to mention one other thing. Many of us on both sides of the aisle support the European Defense Initiative, where our allies work together to ensure a strong deterrent against Russian aggression. This bill sets up a similar sort of initiative for the Pacific. It's not a very catchy name. It's Indo-Asia-Pacific Stability Initiative, but it's working with traditional allies like Japan and South Korea, but also coming allies, we hope, like Vietnam, where we can work together for the stability of that region. And again, the headlines of the day remind us all on why that's important. Mr. Chairman, there's lots of other provisions, obviously, in among the 772 provisions, but I just want to say again, I appreciate this Rules Committee and helping us to get to this place. I think it's something we can all be proud of. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Smith, we're delighted that you're with us. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Thornberry for his work on this and agree with everything he said about the partnership that is involved in this. All members of the House have worked together to help produce this product. We've had conversations with many members, many different committees. It is the way the legislative process should work, and we've had a good working relationship with the Rules Committee throughout that as well. I'll even go so far as to thank our Senate colleagues, Senator McCain, Senator Reid, are also doing a very good job on this, have been great to work with in producing this final product. And I think the chairman is correct. It's a good bill that really goes out a lot of the core substantive issues to make sure that we can provide for our national security going forward. And he's sort of covered the waterfront of most of what's been in the bill, but I agree that's a good product. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't mention the lingering issue. Our bill, I believe, I forget where we came down, $696 billion, something like that, when you throw in the base and the OCO. And, the number for the base actually wound up, well, it's kind of confusing, but like $629 billion, which is significantly above the $549 billion that is the budget cap right now. And we have not yet lifted that budget cap. So as good as this bill is, it doesn't get implemented in full unless we lift those budget caps and get an appropriations deal. Now, for my part, I'm not sure $696 billion is the exact right number. I'm very confident that 549 is not, and we need an appropriations deal. In order to truly implement the full intent of this bill, we need the appropriators to come together, get an agreement on lifting the budget caps and giving us a real number. And as we sit here in mid-November, we're not there. We're already a month and a half now into a CR. The chairman speaks better than I do about how awful the CR is for the Defense Department and for our national security. But we need to find some way to resolve this issue. so that we can provide the resources for national security. And also there's the non-defense discretionary budget, which also has many, many challenges. And lastly, just to keep the meeting interesting, I will say that I personally do not think that it makes sense to be cutting taxes by $1.5 trillion at the same time we're scrapping and scraping to find enough money to provide for national security. If we're going to stand up and say we need to fund the armed services, we need to fund the men and women who serve our country, then we got to be willing to provide the money for it. And I am deeply worried that with our nation $20 trillion in debt, running up deficits close to $700 billion that are projected to go up going forward, status quo, that if we pass a tax cut that's going to further increase that deficit, the estimates are $1.5 trillion, it could be more, that Mr. Thornberry and I are going to have a more and more difficult job being able to provide the resources necessary to fill some of those gaps that he mentioned in our readiness, in our national security capabilities, and like I said, elsewhere in our budget priorities. So the substance of this bill is about as good as any one that I've worked on in the 21 years that I've been here. I think we've got a lot of good policy in there. Now we just need to figure out the money with the broader House, Senate, and the appropriators. So with that, I yield back. I look forward to your questions. And again, I thank the chairman of the Wills Committee for his leadership.
Mr. Smith, thank you very much. Both of you are aware that there are at least two members of this committee that were a part of the House conference, and I'd like to yield my time. I'll catch it up later to the gentlewoman from Wyoming. Gentlewoman, Ms. Cheney is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and it is an honor to serve on the Armed Forces Committee, Armed Services Committee, and to be part of this bipartisan effort, which is far too rare in this body, in my opinion. But I'm proud of this product. I would just like to say, partially in response to Ranking Member Smith's comments, that fundamentally at the end of the day, as the chairman has said, as the ranking member said, we've got to make sure we provide the resources that our armed forces need to do the job we're asking them to do. We cannot do that with the Budget Control Act in place. And we have gotten ourselves, in my opinion, into a system where we raise the caps every year and we leave the act in place. The act itself has got to be repealed. We are operating right now on autopilot. We're operating in a situation in which the BCA may have been put in place for good reason, but we are now in a situation where the debt has increased by $4 trillion since it was put in place. And when you sit in the Armed Services Committee week after week after week and have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, all of the Joint Chiefs, all of the combatant commanders, Secretary of Defense come before us and say again and again and again things like no foe in the field could have done the damage to our armed forces that sequestration has done. We are absolutely abdicating our responsibility in terms of what I believe is our most important constitutional obligation in this body, which is to provide the money that we need for the armed services if we leave the Budget Control Act in place. So I think that we're coming down now to a moment of decision at the end of this year. It's going to be crucially important that we provide the resources that were authorized in this conference report, but it is also going to be crucially important that we repeal the Budget Control Act and get to a place where Congress is appropriating money based upon what we believe our priorities are, not based upon arbitrary limits that were set in a really misguided attempt to try to get control of the debt. So I look forward to continuing to work on this issue, and I want to thank both Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith for their hard work on this NDAA. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Did you have any response, Mr. Smith? Mr. Chairman, when you look up and find that some of your committee members are not present, one of them is Mrs. Cheney. She spends a lot of time up here. She helps us out, and we appreciate your opportunity to share her with us.
We appreciate your willingness to share her with us, too, as well as Mr. Byrne.
The gentleman, as you suggest, Mr. Byrne, also served on the conference committee. He served, I believe, as a result of his service to the Education and Workforce Committee, but he does do that, and we appreciate both of their services very much. Chairman Cole?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome both of you back again. You're two of our stars every time you come because you actually not only produce a superior product, but you also show how Congress ought to be working. And you do it very well. I'm very proud to be an alum of that committee and to sit on the Defense Appropriations Committee. Mr. Chairman, let me start with you first. I want to thank you personally and your staff. We had, as you know, some depot issues, and you guys did a terrific job in defending our position, helping move us along. I had the opportunity to meet with some of your excellent staff people not too long after that. They explained what they had achieved, and I very, very much appreciate the effort you made on our behalf. I think inadvertently the Senate made some mistakes that would have cost our taxpayers a lot, and more importantly, would have hurt our readiness a lot and our ability to respond to crises around the world. So your willingness to sort of get your hands dirty and your staff and get in and help us out is just deeply, deeply appreciated. I know that was true on both sides of the aisle, so I thank you both for that. I also want to touch on something Mr. Smith said, because I think it's really important, and something my friend from Wyoming also mentioned. As important as this bill is, and as good as it is, it's not going to mean much if there's not a BCA agreement and an appropriations product. Now, just so anybody listening understands, the Appropriations Committee doesn't get to make that decision. They live under the law like everybody else does. So it takes a decision above our head to actually do what my friend from Wyoming suggests and address the issue of the Budget Control Act. To be fair to all concerned with that, it did cut the budget deficit more than in half. But the idea was it was never supposed to be used in the way that it was. There was a super committee set up that was supposed to address the real drivers of our debt, and that's the entitlement programs. That's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all that. That's where the money's at around here. So the idea that until we deal with those provisions, we're going to have a problem spending-wise no matter what you do on House Armed Services, no matter what we do on appropriations. I mean, we are less than 30% of all the spending the federal government does. So this has to be, and that, in my view, to be fair, I don't think the last administration was very interested in it. I don't think this administration has been very interested in it. But you're going to have to sit down if we're going to restore the long-term fiscal health of the country. Because I actually agree with Admiral Mullen when he said that one of the great long-term, the greatest in his opinion, threat was the deficit, the inability to put ourselves on sound fiscal footing. Again, as good as this bill is, if we don't get to that point, we can't sustain the kind of military that I know all of us in this room agree that we need, and I think that you guys have laid out an excellent framework for. So I hope we take this as a challenge in the short term to fix what we've got to fix before the end of the year so that we're not dealing with CRs and sequesters next year. And hopefully for the next couple of years, the longer the better. I prefer my friend's solution down there, let's get rid of it. But if you're going to get rid of it, you got to couple it with getting serious about the deficit. One thing that won't work is thinking you can, this is over half the discretionary spending of the United States of America in this single bill, which sort of makes me proud. It's so bipartisan, it's that much of the discretionary budget. But if you think you can address all the shortfalls simply by hacking away the other things, like National Institute of Health or Center for Disease Control, those agencies also play an important part in our defense. Everything from, frankly, biosecurity, but more importantly, you're just more likely to die in a pandemic than a terrorist attack. And that's the truth. So they play important roles. So we just have to have a balanced approach looking at what are the things we really need to fund in this country. But no question, you guys are right that defense needs to be funded. You've laid out a blueprint. Let me just end with this. I want to particularly thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you sought this position a number of times. I remember telling you, sometimes, maybe when you want to do something, the better time would be another time. I think we got you at exactly the right time. I think you, no disrespect to any of your predecessors who I also held in very high regard. I think this committee has had outstanding leadership on both sides of the aisle. When I first got here and served on that committee, we had Duncan Hunter and Ike Skelton. I don't think you had two better people in Congress to hold the two responsibilities that you two now hold. But you are uniquely here at the right moment. You know this agency, you know the policies, you know the history. You spent your entire career on that committee. I know Mr. Smith has also had a long and distinguished service there, and it's really the way Congress ought to work. And I just think the country is so fortunate to have both of you in your respective positions right now. and the manner in which you cooperate and work together back and forth, and the manner in which the members on your committee, up and down the line, work together back and forth is really, I think, probably the most inspiring, committee process in the entire Congress. And so I hope we heed Mr. Smith's words and get that larger deal done, because all this good work won't mean what it should mean unless we do. And I just commend you both for your product and your openness, honestly, to work with all the members, whether they were on your committee or not. The sheer number of amendments that you both laid out, you, Mr. Chairman, talked about on the floor, in committee, and your receptiveness to work with members on both sides of the aisle to give us the best product that we could get, I just think is extraordinarily commendable and a testament to both of you and your staff and how you work. So I'm very, very proud of the bill, very proud to be voting for it, and absolutely commit to both of you to try and work with you to make sure that we get that fix that we both needed, we all need in the Budget Control Act, and ultimately deal with the problem, as my friend from Wyoming said, but also in the context of working toward that budget deficit in these other areas that so far neither party has been willing to embrace and address. With that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. Mrs. Slaughter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, gentlemen. Just a couple of things that I need to understand from my own elucidation. The Medical Device Act, how did that turn out? Is that in the bill?
You could be talking of one of two things.
Yes.
There was an effort on the Senate to get rid of the funding of medical research, and then there was also this whole FDA DOD thing. Which one do you refer?
The FDA.
Oh, as my understanding, the Chairman, is that an agreement has been reached with the Energy and Commerce Committee on both sides, and there's going to be a piece of legislation to rework the precise wording of what we did, and that we have reached an agreement. But Mac, if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. That's my understanding, too, that actually the FDA and the Department of Defense have come to an agreement on the wording of how to handle that. My impression is that leadership on both sides of the Capitol are trying to sort out the vehicle. My understanding, like Adams, is that it would be some other vehicle, but I think that's still under discussion.
I was a little surprised, frankly, to see that you would give DOD the opportunity to decide medical devices and drugs.
Can I
Why
take a stab at
that?
explaining why? And actually, thank the chairman and actually thank our committee. The agreement that now we seem to be in reach of between the FDA and the DOD has been 10 years in the making. So I think what we did legislatively was we forced the FDA to come to the table. And I think it was necessary, and I'll tell you why. There are a number of products out there, primarily not drugs, as I understand it. The biggest example is freeze-dried plasma, which can be incredibly important in the battlefield. There's a French company that makes this, and we are not able to use it for our troops in the field because it doesn't have FDA approval. The French company has no interest in seeking FDA approval. They don't want to sell it in the U.S. or go through that process. So for this long period of time, we've been trying to figure out, what are we going to do? Because it's not a matter that it's, not up to FDA standards. We don't know. So how do we get it? So the DOD tried to do a workaround with the FDA, and they've been stiff-armed for 10 years. So I think it was pretty important that we forced this issue. Now, neither the chairman nor I want the Pentagon to suddenly start approving drugs for all across the country. This was only ever for the battlefield, okay? And if, we're fighting in Afghanistan, we're fighting in Iraq, and there's a French company or a Japanese company or some other company that has a medical product that's going to help the men and women who are serving, but they're not even seeking FDA approval, should we really deny them that health care, or at least deny a chance to say, well, can we look and see if it's something that we need? So I think we needed to do this, and I'm happy that we reached an agreement.
And ma'am, if I could just, because I've just learned about this in the past, I agree with everything Adam said. I would just add color on 2 points. One is medics out in the battlefield are not able to have refrigerated plasma, so that somebody is wounded and starts bleeding out. This freeze-dried plasma is the only thing to keep somebody from bleeding to death. And that's how most people die on the battlefield is they bleed out. So this is the only answer, and as Adam said, for 10 years, this answer that other troops have been using has been available to them, but not to our troops. The only other color point I would add is I found out recently in 2010, the head of Special Operations Command went to the White House to try to encourage the White House and OMB to get FDA moving on this. And as Adam said, it's been stiff-armed the whole way. So it was out of sheer frustration for troops bleeding out on the battlefield that brought this provision here. You know, and I don't think DOD could or should become another FDA, but as even the new administrator of FDA admits, they have not handled this issue or defense issues generally very well. And I hope we're seeing a new day coming.
God, I hope so too. Our idea of having them bleed to death because the FDA didn't approve it, that doesn't, you know, I spent a good part of the weekend with Ken Burns and the story of Vietnam. And I must say that I've never been so sad in my life to see the terrible mistakes the United States made. I'm pretty sure that Westmoreland was about the worst general that we ever had, who seemed to want to take a hill only to give it away after maybe 10 or 15,000 people had died. So this was really interesting to me to find out what it was that you were trying to do. So you have adequate access to the French product? Or now where are we? Does this solve that problem?
Well, as I say, DOD and FDA have reached a compromise on language. It doesn't automatically mean the French product is available.
Well, because we never wanted just to say, you know, somebody, well, if you want to buy something, buy it. There was always going to be a process, and we wanted that process to be through the FDA. But what we had to get around was, like I said, if the company isn't even seeking FDA approval, what's the workaround? And that's what we're trying to do. So there's going to have to be a process. We're not just going to say, okay, it's automatically available. It's going to have to be reviewed. It's going to have to somehow be, to check and make sure that it meets the safety standards that are necessary. But now at least there will be that process. I don't know how long that'll take.
Well, that is totally depressing.
It puts a process in place.
I will tell you that's something I think would say doesn't work at all. And then about, I know the spending, I'm very much concerned about cybersecurity, as I know all of you are. And I've come to think that rather than build another aircraft carrier, I'd like to spend a lot of money on that and making that more secure. Are you satisfied, Mr. Thornberry, that you've got enough money in there to work? I know you've got a lot of money in for IT, which is well overdue, but cybersecurity itself.
Yes, ma'am. I do think we have enough money. We have the best people and the best technology in the world. What we do not have are the best policies and approaches to cybersecurity. And I don't think that's a problem money can fix. So it is really important, and there's a number of things I could point to where we can bring people in with cyber expertise so that they can help defend the country, that we can keep people with cyber expertise so they don't all go run off to work in Silicon Valley. All of that's important, but it's also important, and this is partly on our plate, what do we expect the military to do to defend the country in cyberspace? That's never really been made clear yet.
It should be, though, don't you think?
Yes, ma'am. We've been trying to clarify it,
yeah.
but you got to have an administration and Congress work together because people start worrying about the government reading your emails to grandchildren, and then it becomes hard to have a rational conversation about what the government does to try to protect us against these foreign countries and others who are attacking us in cyberspace every day.
I am very concerned about it because they can bring airplanes down, among other things, which we really need to concern ourselves with. Thank you both. I know you've done a hard job on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hasten to add a lot, but that's Section 730, which is what I believe they were in reference to with the FDA. And I as the young chairman knows, I spoke to the Senate on this, and Commissioner Gottlieb, I held the position you did. I thought they should be involved. I believe they should be aware, if nothing else, to know anything that's brought into medically wise for our men and women, to make sure that our FDA is, if they don't have it purposed yet, that they know what's being introduced. And I think it's critical that we not have the military use our men or women in any way other than our scientists know too.
I've been fighting for what, about 8 years, I think, just to save antibiotics for human beings.
Yeah.
Which is becoming an international problem, and it's very serious, and
Yeah.
needs to be done.
And
My respect for the FDA is pretty near zero.
well, mine's a little bit higher, but my point is that I'm somewhere around 2 then.
Yeah.
But that's not my point. My point is I felt like the chairman of the committee, I felt like the people on the Senate side, they were willing to work with.
It sounds stupid. I mean, as you explain that to me, that is something you had to have.
Well, this
I mean,
is part of
the soldiers had to have that. Right. They didn't care which agency in the federal government was in charge.
And this is part of a larger debate, and you
Yes,
reference it, and that's
it
what we
is,
sort of got
yes.
sucked into. There are a lot of people out there that feel that the FDA moves too slowly, and that you're talking about people who are terminal, trying to try new treatments, experiments that they can get to. We're not diving into that. We're trying to do a very, very tight area for our troops on the battlefield.
It was a
The
bad
larger debate is
relationship between some agencies that chose to take the position that they did, and it was against the men and women who are on the front lines. And
Well,
you know that, and I do
if
too.
soldiers died because of that, that is really a tragedy.
So we're trying to address that.
Mr. Chairman, may I make one other
Yes,
point? But I just want to appreciate Subcommittee Chairman Dr. Burgess, who helps oversee the FDA, who has really helped and worked through this provision so that we can come to a good answer. He understood the issues that Adam and I have been talking about, and I appreciate his support and hard work into getting us to an outcome.
Yeah, Chairman Burgess at that health subcommittee had wide latitude. I'm just simply saying I saw people trying to work together as opposed to work apart, and I think what Mrs. Slaughter's in reference to is something that's working better. Mr. Woodall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to associate myself with Mr. Smith's comments that 549 is not the right level, and we all know that to be true. And as someone who was in Congress when we voted on the Budget Control Act, nobody ever expected us to end up at a 549 level, and we all knew that wasn't going to be true. I hope the same partnership that you all have used to navigate this process, shepherd in a bicameral way a solution here, you will also be able to bring to bear as we deal with the Budget Control Act long term. It makes me feel very good that we're providing the maximum salary increase to troops that the statute provides. It would make me feel even better if we were paying for all of that ourselves instead of asking our kids to pay for some of that down the road. And the entire purpose of the Budget Control Act was to say, well, there's some serious and tough choices that we have to make here, and by creating this structure, we will force Congress to confront these choices. It did not work out that way, and candidly, the calls to repeal, the one thing we did to try to force us to make tough decisions that were actually so tough to make, we imperiled national security instead of making them. Repealing that doesn't give me confidence that we're going to create a better process tomorrow. It makes me think more likely we will have no process tomorrow. So I say that to you because we all believe in national security, and yet we all grapple with funding levels. You all have grappled with that together and with our Senate colleagues and come to a solution. I hope that what you learned through that process, there will be something that will help to guide us through the big deal that must come, and what a longer-term solution to that is. I think we were right in 2011 when we said we needed to encourage the Congress to work harder at prioritizing paying our bills today, and I will regret it if in the name of serving those men and women in uniform, we trade away some of the financial security that this nation has. I know that we don't have to. It's not a choice of one or the other. I know that we can do both together, but you all provide the best example of what doing it together looks like, and I hope to learn from you as the lone Budget Committee member here on how we can expand that. Pardon me. As my senior member on the Budget Committee, the lone rules designee to the Budget Committee, as opposed to my appropriations friends who are designated to the Budget Committee, what that means to find a long-term solution.
And could I comment on that just quickly? And I apologize, this is my sort of larger speech about the budget problem. I don't think people truly understand the problem and how we got here. And the basic problem is that through a whole series of political promises, the way lobbying groups organize, we've created a situation in this country where the overwhelming majority of people want about $10 worth of goods and services for every dollar in revenue that they are willing to provide. And the reason we haven't addressed the issue, and the reason I didn't think the Budget Control Act made any sense, is we were like 2 days away from not being able to lift the debt ceiling and pay our debts when we passed the Budget Control Act back in August of 2011. So we came up to that brink, and we're still unwilling to confront the realistic challenges between revenue and spending. So we created the Budget Control Act and picked these poor souls to be on some committee of, I think there was 12 of them, who were supposed to solve the problem in 6 months, and then we wouldn't have to do sequestration. The problem is we've simply promised more than we can deliver, and we're still doing it. And it just doesn't add up. If you ask Congress, if you ask the American people, they want the budget balanced. And then you ask them, okay, how do you want to increase revenue? Well, we can't raise taxes. All right, well, what programs do you want to cut? And the Pew Research folks do a fascinating poll that I always love to cite, where they list the roughly 18 areas where the federal government spends money. And they ask, do you want to keep it the same, increase it, or decrease it? Increase it or keep it the same has a majority in every category. Even foreign aid eked out a 50-49 victory. And a lot of these other big ticket items were like 2/3 wanted to spend more money on all of these areas. Then you ask them if they want to raise taxes. They don't. So the reason that we don't address it is politically, it's a loser. And everybody knows that. We have got to change the debate. And part of changing the debate is also, getting around some of these dodges that people have. I mentioned that they don't, want to cut anything. But then if you ask them, would you like to cut the federal government 10%? Oh, sure. In fact, if I had a spare 50 grand and could do my own poll, I'd love to do a poll to see how high you could get that number and still have people say yes. Would you like to see the government cut by 75%? Oh, sure, why not? And understand what that means, because most people don't. The public wants to cut the government in the abstract, okay? But then you say, well, all right, fine. So do you want to cut Social Security? Well, no. You want to cut Medicare. Do you want to cut Medicaid? Do you want to cut housing? Do you want to cut defense? That's where we spend the money, okay? So until we start having an honest conversation, and Mr. Cole referenced the mandatory spending programs that are 70% of the budget, and then the tax thing drives me a little bit crazy. And I know you all have convinced yourself that if we reduce taxes, it's somehow going to increase revenue. As I always tell people, if that were true, we'd have the easiest jobs in the world. We'd give everybody their money back, and we'd just magically have more. It doesn't actually work that way, and I have a much longer, detailed argument, which I will spare you on that. But we can't, here we are in the situation, and the big bill that we're supposed to get done before Christmas is to reduce our revenue by another $1.5 trillion. I just, and by the way, it's not accompanied by any sort of mandatory spending reform. And I'm not saying I'd necessarily be in support of whatever it was, but if you're going to do that, at least have the guts to cut the spending. If you want to say the government's too big, we need to give people back their money, taxpayers can spend their money better than government, well, great. Then make the cuts. Because if you don't, what happens is what Mac and I are dealing with. The clear readiness shortfalls, and he mentioned the statistics, 60% of the planes can't fly. We've got things crashing, our service members dying because they're not getting the training or the equipment that they need. But we can't make money up, well, I was going to say we can't make money up out of thin air. We can't make enough money up out of thin air, let's put it that way. And if we keep going down this road, we're not having an honest discussion about it. And 6 years after the Budget Control Act, I don't think the conversation has progressed an inch from where it was in August of 2011 when we first dove into this hole. So that's my speech.
If you'd like to save your $50,000 on that poll, we'll have the tax bill up here on Wednesday, where you can see the number of folks who support tax reform but don't want to see their particular deduction, exemption, or exception go away, so we'll be able to live that. And to be fair to us as an institution, we did pass revenue neutral tax reform reconciliation instructions out of this institution, recognizing your concerns. We were not able to build that support bicamerally, but I appreciate both of your work, and you can be certain the people of the 7th District of Georgia do as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back his time. In fairness to the committee and to our witnesses, please be advised that the SAP Statement of Administrative Policy that was just passed out does not apply to this bill. It applies when the gentleman, Mr. Hensling, comes here, 21st Century Flood Reform Act. So we passed this out slightly early, so the administration, I hope, will end up supporting this too. Mr. McGovern?
Yeah, well, I'll be brief because this is a conference report and it reflects a lot of bipartisan work, and I want to commend you both for that. I have historically had some issues with this bill, and I still have those issues, but I do appreciate the work that you have done. I would just say one regret, and this has nothing to do with you, and that is the House overwhelmingly passed an amendment that I authored to honor our atomic war veterans. Every single member of the House voted for it. We've been doing this time and time again, and it gets dropped in the Senate. And I just, these veterans are dying, as we all know that, a lot of the work that they did was top secret. So even when they went to see their doctors, they couldn't talk frankly about the fact they were exposed to radiation or potentially could have been exposed to radiation, and yet we can't find a way to properly honor them. And I know people in the Pentagon have been against it, and we have some people in the Senate who have done the bidding for the Pentagon on this issue. I just think it's a rotten thing to do to these people who served our country with great distinction. But I know that's not, you all supported it, I appreciate it, and I appreciate your work, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Montgomery, thank you very much. The gentleman, Chairman Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of our witnesses. You have clearly put in a lot of hours and a lot of work in getting us to this point, and I'm appreciative. I don't want to recover what has already been covered with Section 716 of the conference report, 732 of the Senate bill, not covered in the House bill that we dealt with up here during the summer, and that is the FDA portion. Mr. Chairman, I am going to ask unanimous consent to add to the record a letter from 5 previous FDA chairs, or I'm sorry, administrators, on their thoughts on this subject.
Without objection, we'll enter that in the record.
But over the past week, there has been a lot of ground covered on this, and it does appear that there has been resolution, and I am grateful for that. I think everyone will be better for it. Can I just tell you, having been through 3 authorizations of the Food and Drug Administration in my brief tenure here, sometimes it is tough dealing with that agency. It should be the premier agency in our government. The FDA should be what everyone looks to as how a federal agency should be run. Basically touches 25% of every dollar that the federal government spends. But there certainly have been times in the past 10 years and even longer that I'll just tell you, there's sometimes not a week goes by that there's not someone in my office with a tale of woe about how much time and money they have spent trying to accomplish what the FDA has set out for them, and then the rules all change after they have accomplished what they were instructed to accomplish. Having said that, I do believe our new administrator, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, is the right person at the right time, and I think he will do a good job for us. And in fact, I would just tell the chairman and the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, if you do not find that things are working as you expect them to, please communicate that to us, because it is important to all of us that this in fact work. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Chairman Burgess, thank you very much. The gentleman from Florida, Jack
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Thornberry and Mr. Smith are exemplars of how the institution itself ought to function. And all of us rightly praise their efforts. But far too often, we do not see this model that they present us, where the regular order obtains, hearings are held, markups, and good faith negotiations. It's regrettable that is not the standard for how we do business overall. My good friend, Ms. Cheney, referenced that it's far too rare, and I certainly agree with her in that regard. I also agonize with all of you as we point out the fact that if the budget caps are not lifted or not changed, that the DOD wouldn't receive the money that's authorized here, and then all of the things that all of us in this room know will cause a great deal of agony with reference to the military, a great deal of risk, a great deal of harm to the individual services as well as the individuals who are serving. So toward that end, I'll point out that the minority does not have the ability standing alone to lift those caps. The majority controls this institution, and it would be helpful if we use the model that these gentlemen have presented to us frequently and regularly. I had the good fortune of working with both of them for a considerable number of years, and I know that there are adults in the room, but there are too many people with too many selfish interests that do not model themselves after Mac and Adam, and that's regrettable. Mr. Thornberry, you mentioned a positive provision in your conference report that would allow military spouses to more easily get new professional licenses after moving. How do you reconcile that with the provisions in the tax bill as I understand them at present? And I would imagine come Wednesday we'll see more. But that provision makes it more expensive for military families to sell their houses. And it requires a homeowner to have owned and lived in a home for at least 5 of the last 8 years to get a tax exemption from money made on the sale of a home. And all of us know that military families must relocate every 2 to 3 years, which would prevent them from taking benefit of a tax benefit available to everyone else. So how do you reconcile that with your rightly mentioned positive provision?
Mr. Hastings, I know there were at least 1 or 2 provisions in the tax bill that inadvertently disadvantaged military families. Now, I'm no expert on the mortgage deduction. I know there was a moving expense issue, which Chairman Brady informs me has been corrected. Mm-hmm. So I do think that we want to work our way through, just like I think the conference report Adam and I bring you today is even better than it was because we've worked through a number of issues. There will, I'm sure, be issues to work through on the tax side. But I'm increasingly convinced that how we treat military families is the key determinant for whether we can retain the top quality military personnel we need. And some of these things, like the spouse licensure, seems pretty small. It's not a lot of dollars. But I think that health care, et cetera.
What is it, $500?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right. I see the provision that I brought to your attention as a little bit different. But I want to move on. I'm sure all of us will have a lot to say, but I want to reiterate what I said about lifting the caps. And perhaps all of us will come to a better understanding that in the respective committees in this Congress, if all of the individuals were permitted to have the input, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. And I predict come Wednesday and Thursday of this week, the fact that this tax bill has the kind of minor, albeit unintended consequence, as I just pointed out. There are going to be others that we're going to hear about, and not only as it pertains to military families, but citizenry in this country at writ large. And that's what happens when you go in back rooms and when you shut out everybody else and you do not produce this kind of product. Working with both these gentlemen, we have produced in past years intelligence products that everybody had input to. Mac and I worked on a number of things before we stood up the Defense Intelligence Agency. But there was never a time that I did not feel that he was genuinely concerned about the concerns of the minority. And I'm sure that that's the case in the Armed Services Committee and the product that has been presented to us. But there's going to be a rough road ahead, and we need to stop the corrosiveness and get on with the business of following this kind of model that has been presented to us by these gentlemen and their fellow committee members who have that same dynamic working with them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Collins, also a veteran of this country and who serves this country right now. And I appreciate the gentleman's service. We had a Friday all across this great nation, a chance to thank our veterans. Please do not let me not say that today. Doug, thank you for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you to the two. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit on this, especially as currently serving. There's a couple areas. One, before I get to my main point, I know we put in the cyber center security. They changed the language to sort of any school. We had talked about mainly our senior military colleges. I'd like to see that, continued into the next year because I think our senior military colleges scattered throughout very much reflect our regular military academies. I think it would be a better placement for these, to put them on them. But I want to turn attention to something that has bothered me for a little while, and I see it, and I know many have, and Representative Perry's here as well, is the recruitment issue. And I just saw this article even today, and before I even knew this, I was going to talk about this issue, I saw this article today that the Army had quietly lifted its ban on allowing people with a history of mental illness, self-mutilation, and drug abuse to serve in the military. To meet recruitment goals. We talk about our all-volunteer force, and we're very proud of our all-volunteer force. I volunteer, the others have volunteered, but there's a concern I'm having here about our all-volunteer force, and I think it's something we're going to have to start addressing. Is it an all-volunteer force when last year we had 69,000 recruits in the Army who did poorly on aptitude tests, increased the number of waivers for pot use, and offered hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses? Here's an issue that bothers me. Is it really all-volunteer that in 2014 we used $8.2 million in bonus for enlistment? In 2016 it was $284 million, and in 2017 we used $424 million to encourage people to join an all-volunteer force. If those numbers continue at that rate, it's not an all-volunteer force at this point. We're paying people to come to work for the military. I'm just curious at this point, and I don't want to prolong this, but I think it's a very interesting issue. I don't serve on armed service. I appreciate what y'all do, and what y'all put together is excellent. But this is a concern from not only a financial standpoint, but also a readiness standpoint. And in others, if we're lowering standards, paying out more, I would just like to get some input on where do you see this going? Is there something we can do? What do you think the long-term outlook is on this?
Just briefly, Mr. Collins, something like 70% of the eligible age group in this country who could serve are ineligible to serve. It's obesity, it's low test scores, it's a whole variety. So you're just start out, the pool is 30% of the age group. And then you start narrowing down on some other factors, and basically you are in competition with employers and top colleges for a pretty small number of folks. If, as I'm sure all of us hope, the economy improves, that competition will intensify. And so it is a real challenge to recruit and then retain, so we teach somebody to be a cyber expert. you can't possibly compete with some of the salaries that could be made elsewhere, so how do you retain them? Yep. They're not going to stay because we're going to outpay Silicon Valley or whatever the comparable is. But one of the reasons I believe so strongly that we ought to give them the full pay raise to which the statute says they are entitled this year, rather than cut it by 0.5%, is sending a message that we value you and we're not going to nickel and dime you. Now, they're not going to stay for that reason, but maybe it helps send the message. And then you add, in addition to health care and the housing and so forth, nobody's going to go in the military to get rich, but the question is, how big a sacrifice do you expect these top quality recruits to make to serve their country? And we're going to have to keep working with this. I don't have any magic answers. I do believe the problem will get worse, and I yield that.
Well, go ahead. I'd love to hear it.
No, I agree with everything Max said. And the only thing I guess I would say is I'm less troubled by the increasing the incentives to get them to join. I mean, that's just basic competition. I mean, that's how we have to try to attract the best that we can. I am very troubled by what you said about reducing the standards, because that fundamentally changes the military. I think, look, I mean, given all the facts that Mac just laid out and that you laid out as well, if we are going to recruit people in the military for an all-volunteer force, there's going to be, money's going to be part of it. Benefits are going to be part of it. How does this fit? And Mac's right. No one, if you're looking to get rich, this isn't what you're doing. But can you make your life work? Right. As just a bare minimum. We're going to have to address those issues.
Well, I think my question did exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to throw it out here, and let's bring. You started, Chairman. You started on this issue of the depleting pool of talent, if you would. Actually, you take it even past that. You start taking it down even further, to where you're competing for these 69, 70,000 people. You're competing in about a pool of about 120, 140,000 people, and that means you've almost got to run the table to get the entire lot. I think the concern that we need to have, standards, one issue over here, but it's got to play into it if we're still hitting these goals. And for many on this dais and others who maybe would like to even see in our Congress increasing our troop levels in certain, especially as we've talked about through the Navy, Army, Air Force is down. We're looking at pilot shortages. You mentioned this earlier. And I do not want this, to come across as the headline of the night. I am not saying go away from an all-volunteer force. However, on these bases here of what we're seeing and the amounts paid out in the port, we're still getting a shrinking demographic of those who will even take what we're seeing here. We have some of the best in the world that wants to, but we're also seeing them isolated more in geographical areas of the country, geographical areas in certain parts of the country, and we're not seeing a lot of what we have seen in a broad cross-section. It's been said that less than, and these numbers have probably changed over the years because my data is a little bit old, actual engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the battles that we're currently facing, is less than actually 2%, probably about 1.5% of the total population. It's no wonder there's a disconnect. For those of us who've actually went to Iraq in a support role, and those who've never even been in the service, or much less been in a situation of conflict. This is going to be the conversation that takes us, I believe, much further down the line. This is why I do like, and I think what my friend from Massachusetts and from Florida also both said, is the discussion part of this. But this began to bother me I heard a presentation on it. It's continued in my thoughts and now coming again. This is something we're going to have to look at more and more.
When my colleague finishes, would you yield?
I'll go ahead and yield now.
Well, when I hear you, my immediate reaction is that we should consider a draft. The pool widens if you do that, and then we can determine exemptions for people with bunions and stuff like that if need be. Yeah. But going down the path, looking toward the future, we should broaden the pool in everybody in this country. And it wasn't a particularly bad situation in the Second World War, the Korean War, or the Vietnam War, when significant numbers of people had to be trained. It didn't appear to have the standards, but they met those standards, and they were some extremely courageous and brave people that were trained up in a hurry to do the things necessary to protect this country. If we want to level the playing field and make it right,
then we ought to reinstitute the draft.
Well, and reclaim my time, and I appreciate it. And that just a former, just within the past 10 years, former head of the Army Reserve actually is doing a lot of discussion on this very issue right here, on the makeup of our makeup of our fighting forces, the makeup of how they're going. And again, it's without any political statement. It's just a simple fact. How are we going to put these people? Our armed forces are getting more and more technical, no matter what we're going after. Those require more and more folks to come in with skills that, frankly, are very valuable on the outside. So the question becomes something that we're really going to have to talk about, and it's going to be a hard conversation, because I think at a certain point in time you do have to say, how much are we willing to pay for the all-volunteer force, or how much is actually the service part of this, without lowering standards, without lowering other things that we, as the ranking member said, this is becoming more of a concern, frankly, yes, for those of us who are still in and coming in. But there's also a financial component that is growing in just 3 years, 8.2 million to 424 million in just 3 years. And as the economy gets better, I could see that going up further and further, eating away at readiness, eating away at other things as we go forward. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I thank the work that has been done. I look forward to continuing as we do every year moving forward on this bill, and we'll go forward from there. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman who also signed the conference report, and we appreciate his service, the gentleman, Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I will not ask any questions. I will thank the two gentlemen who lead our committee. You did a superb job. I'm proud to serve on the committee with you, and I'm proud to support this product. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from the state of Washington, Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to thank Mr. Smith and Mr. Thornberry are always amaze me at the level of cooperativeness that they bring to this, reflects from their committee work, and appreciate that very much. I think the product you have in front of you is a good example of the kind of things that can get done when you have that kind of a work ethic. And the things that you've done to increase the readiness of our armed forces, I think one of the most important things we do here in Congress, and that you're approaching it in the right way as far as the work that you've done to do that as well. So I don't really have any questions. I just wanted to express my appreciation for everything that you've done for us, and I would yield back, Mr.
Chairman yields back. I'm the gentleman from Windsor, Colorado, Mr. Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Thornberry, just a quick question. You are seeking to increase the amount of defense discretionary spending. Is that accurate?
Above what we're spending today?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And how do we cap non-defense discretionary spending in this process? How do we make sure that we don't just have a dollar for dollar, that we recognize that defense discretionary has to go up, and we do that? Is this the right vehicle?
No. I would suggest, as a number of members have talked about, we're going to have this conversation about the caps and the broader appropriation agreement that has to be made. What we do here is try to assess what we need for the men and women who serve our country in the military, so they have ships that sail, but also so that they don't work 100 hours a week and run into other ships, like has happened twice recently in the Pacific. Have airplanes that fly, et cetera. That's what this bill authorizes, program by program, what is needed to, and I won't even say adequately, but at least come closer to adequately supporting them and funding our military. As members of Congress, we all have these other responsibilities for other programs. But if I can make one other point, Mr. Buck, I believe that we owe those men and women, if we're going to send them out on a mission, they deserve the best our country can provide in the way of training, equipment, and support. And it should not be contingent upon some other program or some other reduction. And part of my frustration in recent years is that people want to tie defense to some other sort of agenda. We owe these people the right thing, and if we're not going to support them, we shouldn't send them out there to do that. Defense, I believe, is the first job of the federal government. It needs to stand on its own. We ought to do the right thing by them, and then we can have these other discussions. But tying it to other things, and especially this dollar-for-dollar nonsense, is wrong, but it's morally wrong to put a contingency on how well we'll support somebody who's out there today on some destroyer trying to prevent Kim Jong-un's missiles from reaching the homeland.
Can I just finish? I just want to, and I will recognize you in a moment, but I agree with you, Chairman Thornberry, and I have a son who will deploy December 1st, and I want to give him every advantage that we can possibly give him and his fellow service members. I also have a grandson who I am concerned about because I continue to see the deficit grow and grow. And so, as has been mentioned earlier, this is an issue that it's a multi-generational issue. How do we best equip the troops that we put at risk, and how do we best equip our country for the long run? And I appreciate your thoughts on that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, as you might imagine, I have a slightly different take on this. I mean, there's 2 points. I mean, first of all, I certainly agree with the chairman that once we decide what the mission is for the people who serve in our military, it is irresponsible, and I would even agree immoral, not to fund it. And quite honestly, that's where we're at right now. That's what a readiness shortfall means. And they have this very complicated way of doing things at the Pentagon, but they have contingency plans for just about everything, and then a few more things beyond that. And that is what our policymakers have said you need to be prepared to do, whether you're talking about North Korea, dealing with Russia, dealing with China, dealing with terrorism, whatever. Here's what you need to be prepared to do. And then we have the amount of money that is available to prepare them to do it. There is an enormous mismatch between those two things right now, which is why we are so short of pilots, why we have so many planes that don't fly, why we are not getting the adequate training in there. Because we're trying to do more on a national security standpoint than the money that we're making available to do it. So, now to a certain degree, I mean, that's always going to be the case. I mean, you can spin out a whole bunch of nightmare scenarios. You know, what if Russia invades Western Europe at the same time that North Korea invades South Korea? I mean, you can only be ready for so much. But I think we have underfunded our military as goes against the mission that we're currently giving them. However, there are 2 points that I would add to the conversation on that. I don't think it is immoral to say this is a zero-sum game, all right? There is a finite amount of money out there, either to raise through taxes, however you want to raise those taxes, or to spend on various number of programs. And the less revenue you take in, or the more you spend somewhere else, the less you have available for other things. And if those other things are priorities for you, it is naive in the extreme to say, well, defense doesn't have anything to do with that, taxes don't have anything to do with that. Yes, it really is troubling that our infrastructure is crumbling and bridges are collapsing and killing people. Yes, you know, we should fund research, you know, to make sure that we can find cures for diseases, all these other priorities. But look, taxes and defense, they don't have anything to do with that.
Well, let me just interrupt you for a second, because I read the Constitution fairly recently, back in law school a few years ago, and my memory was that the Constitution does talk about national defense and does talk about defending this country. It does not talk about a crumbling bridge. And so if you're asking me where we should spend our money, it should be spent on the men and women who are risking their lives to make us secure in this position.
And I appreciate that opinion. But throughout the country, there are other priorities. And all I said, I didn't even necessarily disagree with what you just said. What I'm saying is that decision that you just made impacts all of these other things. Now, if you want to say, like you just said, look, national security is where it's at. Bridges could fall apart all across the country. All of this stuff can happen. I don't care. National security is what matters.
I don't think I used the words "I don't care," but go ahead.
No, you didn't use those words, but you pretty much said, this is our priority, that other stuff isn't in there. Okay, and if that's your position, that's honest and legitimate. But don't tell me that that position doesn't impact all of those other things, even if your reading of the Constitution is that all of those other things are not as high a priority, and therefore if they get shortchanged, then that's just the way it plays out. The one impacts the other. That's the one point. And the second thing that I think we need to think about in all of this is no matter how you structure the budget, given the size of the debt, given the size of the deficit, given where our revenue is at, and then you look at the national security threat environment that we have, we're not going to be able to fund everything that we would like to do to provide for national security. We're simply not. So does it make sense maybe to, instead of saying, gosh, we're underfunding all of these priorities, we've got to get more and more money so that our troops can actually be ready, does it make sense to say, maybe we should dial back what it is that we're asking them to do? Maybe we should come up with a national security strategy and train a military that is in a position to carry out that national security strategy that reflects the resources that are available. Because for 7 years, we've been having this conversation. And for 7 years, we haven't provided the money to meet the national security strategy that we have. And I'm sorry, I know I've gone on too long here, but this was best summed up when the chairman and I met with the folks of Net Assessment, and they said, you know, it's a catastrophe. We do not have enough money to fund the priorities that we set out in our 2012 national security strategy. And so I asked him how short we were. He had no idea. He looked at me like, I don't know. How can you tell me we don't have the money to fund our priorities, and you don't even know how much it would cost to fund those priorities? We've got to get at that part of it, too, to make sure that the money we're spending on national security is being well spent and is training our troops so that we're not asking them to do the impossible, basically.
Thank you. And Chairman Thornberry, I just want to thank you for your understanding of the balance that is involved in this. And it was not too long ago when Admiral Mullen testified, I believe on the Senate side, that the greatest threat to this country was not Iran or Russia or China, but was our national debt. And when he testified, I believe our national debt was at $13 trillion. It is now over $20 trillion. And so thank you for your testimony today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. I appreciate your service and devotion to the duty of the cause of supporting this great nation and men and women who protect it. If you'll please make sure we have an awesome stenographer here, that you leave whatever you brought in writing to allow her to finalize the report that would take place of your appearance today. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, sir. We'd now like to welcome, we have a distinguished guest from North Carolina and perhaps a gentleman from Ohio who would be seeking the committee's time concerning the conference report to the National Defense Authorization Act for 2018 that accompanies H.R. 2810. The gentlemen, we're delighted that you're here. Anything you brought in writing, please do leave for Austin Stock for allowing her chance to properly complete the record that would be made available today. Which seeks times first, gentlemen? Mr. Meadows, we're delighted that you're here. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your service on this critical committee. Mr. Chairman, we certainly appreciate your support of our military, and it's been evidenced in the testimony here today and certainly the back and forth as the Armed Services Committee has done a yeoman's job, to put it in military terms, in terms of getting something across the finish line in a bipartisan manner. The gentleman from Ohio and myself have an amendment for your consideration that would actually increase the 2018 budget caps to match what we have in the NDAA authorization. So essentially empowering our appropriators to make the best decisions on behalf of our military men and women. And by doing so, we feel like that this particular amendment would be consistent with not only our desire to properly fund our military, but would also be consistent with trusting our appropriators to help us make some of those critical decisions that have already been articulated in much more eloquent terms than I am now, in terms of how we have really held our military hostage to a Budget Control Act that forces us to take a number of different gyrations to try to get them adequate funding. And so the gentleman from Ohio and I believe that it is time that we start to address that, certainly with actually some urging from some members on this very committee. But with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman Jordan, we're delighted that you're here. Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the chairman and all the good members of this great committee. Just 2 quick points. My good friend from North Carolina is exactly right. This is about consistency. We're going to vote on an NDAA bill tomorrow that has a dollar amount for our men and women in uniform that can actually not be appropriated to them until we deal with the budget cap. It's really that basic. So in an effort to say We think this is the right amount. This is what our folks who serve our country, protect our country deserve. Let's go ahead and deal with the budget cap issue with our military. The chairman, in his testimony just a few minutes ago, says there's folks around here who want to tie the defense to some other agenda. That's exactly right. We don't. We just want to fund our defense for the number we all agree on. A bunch of Democrats are going to vote for it. A bunch of Republicans are going to vote for it. Let's just deal with that. We can deal with the other issues later. But let's just be consistent. Let's do exactly what the chairman and the ranking member talked about. Let's fund our military at the number we all think is appropriate to defend this great nation in this troublesome world we find ourselves in. Plain and simple, let's get it done now, and then we can deal with the appropriations process that we have to deal with in a few short weeks.
Thank you very much. Let me just say this, that I appreciate both of you coming. It's a strong show of support, not only shot in the arm for the military and support, but I really appreciate you really being on record about where you stand. I appreciate you. Is there any member of the committee, Mr. Chairman Cole?
Yeah, just quickly, because I want to commend both the gentlemen too. I think you're doing the right thing. Now the partisan and the bicameral realities are, in the Senate in particular, you're going to need Democratic votes. And so that's just the sad fact. But the basic point you're making is the right point. The Appropriations Committee actually appropriated less money in non-defense discretionary. So it's of the opinion it can live with a lower number even than it has today, let alone a higher number. And just for the record, I'll point out inside that committee, we also redeployed money away from 9 of the committees, so there's more money on veterans, $5 billion more, matched the president's request, and more money for Homeland Security, where the president had the largest increase in a decade. So all those other committees did take a substantial hit beyond, the top line number. So 9 of them actually went further than that. The prevailing opinion on the committee. Now, to be fair to my friends on the other side, that's a partisan decision too. I mean, my Democratic colleagues would probably look at it differently, but the majority of the committee agreed with your position. So whether or not we can do this or not, whether or not politically, given the fact you've got to have 60 votes in the Senate under their rules, and you don't need them over here, that's going to be I'll leave that to leadership to make. But I just want to, for the record, make clear I agree with what you're trying to do. We can do with less in some areas in order to redeploy funds in this area. So I agree with your objective. Hope we can achieve it. Have some skepticism knowing the Senate as I do. Without a yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Slaughter?
No questions. Thank you, gentlemen.
Ms. McGovern?
And if your amendment isn't made in order, will you vote for the rule?
I can't speak for the entire caucus, but I certainly would.
Well, just a suggestion. I think if you want to get your amendments made in order like this, you're going to.
Well, no, listen, I don't come before this committee. Yeah. If I put forth an amendment, I always plan to vote for the rule. I do plan to vote for this particular
even if your amendment's not made in order?
Even if my amendment is not made in order.
Well, it was nice of you to be up here.
Thank you very much. I think that's the spirit by which both of you have approached this, is your public support for a position that you do believe in. Thank you very much, Dr. Burgess. Mr. Byrne, Mr. Newhouse, Mr. Buck, Mrs. Cheney. Ms. Cheney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to express my support for what you are trying to do, and thank you for being here. And I just want to make one additional point, which is that I think for too long our conference has been falsely divided between people who call themselves or think of themselves as fiscal hawks and people who think of themselves as national security hawks. We are all both. And I think that debate really harms our conference and harms our security, because at the end of the day, it is not the defense budget that's driving the debt. And my good friend from Colorado, as he well knows, the second part of the quote from Admiral Mullen is, the reason that the debt is such a huge national security threat is because it harms our ability to resource the military. So I look forward to continuing to work with both of you and with all the members of our conference to be in a position where we can get at mandatory spending and stop strangling the Defense Department as a way to try to get at the debt issue, which is frankly not going to happen, and we've got a fundamental responsibility and obligation. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Joan. Yields back her time. Gentlemen, I noticed that you have been accompanied by a gentleman, a leader in our United States military, United States Army, a distinguished officer, and a real gentleman.
General.
And Mr. Scott Perry, I noticed, was with you, and I want to thank Mr. Perry also for his not only service to this great nation, but also to your organization and your conference. And I appreciate both of you being here very much. If you'll please, anything you brought in writing for us, stenographer, we appreciate it. Thank you very much. Is there any other member that would seek to provide input to conference report to National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018, accompanying H.R. 2810? Seeing none, this now closes the hearing portion. We will now open up the hearing portion for H.R. 2874 and would recognize that we are a little bit late. I note that the gentleman, the young chairman of the committee, Mr. Henseling, had Jab Henseling week last week. We're going to do it again this week. Without objection, anything Kevin Ryder will be entered the record, and the gentleman is recognized.
Chairman Sessions, Ranking Member Slaughter, members of the Rules Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on H.R. 2874, the 21st Century Flood Reform Act. The bill is comprised of 7 negotiated bills that passed the Financial Services Committee, 6 of which attracted bipartisan support, including bills that passed by votes of 58 to 0, 53 to 0, 58 to 0, and by voice vote. I want to thank the sponsors of these bills, Mr. Duffy, Ms. Velasquez, Mr. Zeldin, Mr. Lukemeyer, Mr. Ross, and Mr. Royce for their hard work in preparing this package of needed legislation for consideration by the House. The 21st Century Flood Reform Act reauthorizes the National Flood Insurance Program for 5 years, introduces private market competition to the market for flood insurance, and provides needed reforms to help both policyholders and taxpayers. It benefits policyholders by requiring the National Flood Insurance Program to clearly communicate their full flood risk. It provides more than $1 billion in mitigation money, the most ever authorized, Mr. Chairman, to help people make modifications to lower their flood risk or to actually relocate. It also protects hardworking taxpayers with common sense changes that begin phasing out taxpayer-provided subsidies for properties that flood over and over and over again. Most importantly, the legislation also gives everyone the opportunity for lower-cost flood insurance by opening up the program to private market competition. This is absolutely transformational. Having just one insurance provider monopolize flood risk for the entire country makes no sense. We all know competition provides more choices at lower cost. In states like Pennsylvania, where there is a nascent private market, buyers are finding more affordable flood insurance. Pennsylvania's insurance commissioner gave several examples in testimony before our committee, including one property owner who was quoted a $6,000 annual premium by the National Flood Insurance Program but found private coverage for just $900. Mr. Chairman, many save hundreds of dollars and some actually save thousands. Separately, an independent study found that 69% of Louisiana homeowners and 92% of Texas homeowners could see cheaper premiums with private insurance than with the government's flood insurance. Again, competition and innovation can prove transformational to the program. Taxpayers have every right to an efficient system that minimizes their cost. Homeowners deserve a competitive and innovative market that gives them the freedom to choose the flood insurance policy that's right for them. All of us have seen on our television screens the appalling human suffering left by the recent hurricanes. Shortly after Hurricane Harvey hit my home state of Texas, I went to Houston and met with a number of victims, heard their harrowing tales, went to one neighborhood that had flooded 3 times in 8 years, Mr. Chairman. One home in Houston has flooded 16 times over 6 years. Something is fundamentally wrong in America, and something is fundamentally dangerous in America when the policies of the federal government encourage people to live in harm's way. Many are ready to move. We should help them do so. This bill helps and encourages people living in dangerous areas to mitigate, move, or to flood-proof. It also ensures the taxpayer doesn't have to pay to rebuild the same house 5 times, 10 times, or 15 times over. 1% of the properties are causing 25% of the losses of a program that is simply not sustainable. Yet again, the National Flood Insurance Program encourages these homeowners to stay right where they are. Encouraging people to build and then rebuild and rebuild again in these flood-prone areas is neither smart nor compassionate. We can pass a long-term reauthorization of the flood insurance program. This is smart and compassionate, and we can do that by passing the 21st Century Flood Reform Act. This bill will begin to make our nation's flood insurance program more sustainable, more stable, safer, and affordable, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Ms. Capuano, welcome to the Rules Committee. We're delighted that you're here. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a long time since I've been here, and after today's hearing, I remember why. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to be here. I'm pinch hitting for Ms. Waters, who couldn't make it today. You may be surprised to hear me say that the current system of providing flood insurance in America does need to be updated. But you may not be surprised to also hear me say that this is not the way to do it. This bill will make flood insurance more expensive, less available, and less fair to consumers along the shores of our oceans, lakes, and streams. The bill will impact more than the coastal elites, as you like to call people like me on occasion, unless you think that down east Maine and North Carolina and Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas qualify for that title. Prior to 2005, many of us knew that the system needed to be reformed, but the pressure to act wasn't there, and the National Flood Insurance Program ran without a deficit. Then we got hit with Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. And then in 2008, we got hit with Ike, 2011, Irene, and of course in 2012, Superstorm Sandy. Collectively, those superstorms required the NFIP to borrow $26 billion. The impact of those storms shook the flood insurance system to its core and initiated real consideration of reforming the system. Earlier this year, Congress relieved the NFIP of $16 billion of that debt so they could adequately respond to the Harvey, Irma, and Maria disasters that devastated Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Honestly, if Congress simply relieved the remainder of that debt burden from prior superstorms, the NFIP would get on solid financial footing, and we could go about thoughtful reform of the system. But some in Congress don't want that. They don't want NFIP to be on solid reform. They want to change the system for the sake of changing the system. That's the reason we couldn't pass reform bills in the past and the reason we're considering H.R. 2874 today. Here's some of the detailed reasons the bill is bad for America. First, as I've said, it does nothing to address the carrying costs of our prior superstorms. The sort of storms that our system was never intended to cover. It requires increased premiums. It requires increased premiums on middle-income homeowners. It requires increased fees and assessments on those same middle-income people. The bill prohibits certain current policyholders from even getting NFIP coverage. Even the American Bankers Association opposes that provision. The bill reduces the risk pool by allowing some current policyholders to opt out. This will absolutely lead to higher costs for those that are required to stay in the program. The Independent Community Bankers Association opposes that provision. This bill requires NFIP to give its proprietary insurance information to competitors. No other competitor is required to do that, which will clearly lead those competitors to cherry pick. Once they cherry pick, they'll take the best customers, the least risky customers, leaving only the most risky customers in the pool, which again will even increase further insurance costs even more. The bill does nothing to fund updated, accurate flood maps. The bill does little to fund mitigation measures so future floods can be contained or prevented. Finally, this bill makes it harder for homeowners to protect themselves from the few inconsiderate insurance companies in a court of law. I want to repeat, I agree that some aspects of our current flood insurance program need to be reformed. I agree that properties that suffer repetitive losses should be discouraged from rebuilding in flood-prone areas. But this bill is too draconian and does not consider regional economic differences. I agree that encouraging flood mitigation projects is worthwhile, but leaving every state to do that with little and no help from the federal government almost ensures that nothing will get done. I agree that trying to build a private insurance market is an admirable goal, but this bill does so with little regard for consumers. Finally, by weakening the flood insurance system, you pretty much guarantee that the victims of future storms, and there will be large ones and small ones, will have no choice but to rely on the largesse of the federal government through disaster assistance, because they will have nowhere else to turn. For all these reasons and more, I urge you to oppose H.R. 2874, and I'm sure that you will do so.
Thank you very much, Ms. Capuano. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I don't know whether it was you or your crack staff, Jennifer, who is your parliamentarian, told me that she believed or you believed that 1% of the of those that have these policies create about 30% of the cost.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I could, so what we call repetitive loss properties, yes, approximately 1% are causing about 25 to 30% of the losses. But even more important than the financial loss, these people are in harm's way. Again, I went to Houston after Harvey had hit, met with a family, two families, that had lived in a neighborhood that had flooded 3 times in 8 years. I mean, a harrowing tale of one father holding on to his children as the streets were flooding. They want to leave. They want to leave. And so contrary to what my colleague said, this bill, 2874, has more mitigation money than has ever been authorized by Congress before. Mitigation money that can be used to elevate a property, to help flood-proof a property, or to help relocate a property. Approximately 1/3 of the mitigation money already is devoted to relocations. And so there will be $1 billion authorized for those activities, approximately 25, 28% more than is currently authorized. And so it's just, again, it is smart and compassionate in these properties that flood over and over and over again. It is both a matter of their lives and taxpayer money that needs to be saved.
What would this bill say policy-wise to the person if they move to the person who might purchase that property?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we have an entire disclosure title here, and so the NFIP will require there to be disclosures about any previous flood activities that have taken place. That has to be disclosed in order for the property to qualify for NFIP. It's important that people know before they buy exactly what type of properties are they buying into, and so the disclosure is a very important part of this bill.
Thank you very much. Chairman Cole?
In the interest of time, I'm not going to take not going to take any time to ask questions. I do want to, again, it's always good to see both my friends. They're both great members. I said so many nice things about you last time. I'm not going to do them again this time, but I will hold it for the future when we have a little more time. Well, you just need to come more often, you know, and this is on the occasion of his retirement. Even you would have to be nice then, Mike. So, but I'm happy to do it. But I do want to commend my friend for taking on. I know you have different opinion, and I appreciate the fact that you, too, recognize that we do need to do something here. So maybe we can hash something out, but this really needs to get addressed. And I'm proud that we're going to have a vehicle on the floor to do it. I look forward to supporting my friend's legislation. Yield back.
Ms. Slaughter?
Yes. Thank you. I'm happy, too, the fact that you're not going to let people just rebuild over and over again. Does Texas have any regulations against building on floodplains?
Well, it's a community-by-community basis. Again, I'm not an expert at Texas state law as a federal legislator, so it. I know there are different flood. No, I'm not. Never served in the Texas legislature, so I've got more than I can say grace over here than trying to figure out what goes on in Austin, Texas.
It just seems to me, if you've been in a place that's flooded 8 times, you're in a place that's been floodplain. That doesn't make a bit of sense at all to me, but it may be in your state. And it sounds a little bit to me like global warming when I hear all the troubles that Mr. Capuano has given in a pretty short number of years, right? Because I don't remember growing up that way, that there was a hurricane every 2 or 3 minutes here. But I hope we can really get smarter about what we're doing. This is crazy to spend this kind of money. And that debt is outrageous, I think, for flood insurance. But I did not know there was private flood insurance. I thought that only the federal government provided that.
Presently, about 2% of the market is private. And so if we want to have an enlarged private market, and again, where it is working to some extent in both Pennsylvania and Florida, you are seeing a number of policyholders pay less, and at the same time, you see the liability getting off of the taxpayer books onto private books. So it's at least an option, and it's a major provision of H.R. 2874.
I had the understanding the reason we didn't have private insurance is nobody would carry it.
If
And the
I may,
federal government did it as a last resort.
There has never been a prohibition for private insurance, but of course they will not come in. Why should they insure you if they think you're going to be flooded?
8 times.
Well, then the bill does no harm.
Well, what this bill does is gives the private insurance companies an advantage over their competitors by providing them with proprietary information that no other insurance company would share with anyone else, number one. Number two, it doesn't require the private companies to insure anyone. It is unequivocal, and I don't blame them. I would do it if I were an insurance provider. I would cherry pick. I would provide insurance to those people that really don't need it as much, leaving those that do need it more to pay more. Without people, and by the way, Mr. Chairman, your question about 1% of the people, that's true in any insurance pool, including health insurance. If you took all of the infants in the ICU, you took all of the people over the age of 85, and you took all the people with congenital heart disease and took them out of the insurance pool, that'd probably be about 3, 4, 5% of the population at about 40% of the cost, which is true in any insurance pool, same as this. The question is whether you want to provide insurance to these people or not. And again, I couldn't agree more. We do want to discourage people from rebuilding in severe floodplains, but proof is in the pudding. When the people of New Orleans were allowed to move back, most of them did, and they are 9 feet below sea level. So it is one thing to say that we're doing them a favor. It is another thing to say to them, you have to leave. Now, I'm not suggesting we should do nothing. I totally agree. We have houses in Massachusetts that fall into the ocean every year. But you don't just say to everybody else, too bad, that's what you're going to do. At least I don't think you do. If that's the case, half of Florida will be gone in a few years, and half of the Gulf Coast will be gone in a few years. We had a former colleague, Gene Taylor, who lost his house in Katrina. He built it right back in the exact same spot to flood standards, but he wanted to go back. And by the way, this bill also does nothing to help the consumers. And you'll hear a lot of horror stories in both Katrina and Sandy. People fought with their insurance companies repeatedly because, again, I don't blame them. Insurance companies are not in the business of giving out money. They are in the business of making a profit like all businesses. God bless them. But that means they then say to people, sorry, your claim is denied. And this bill actually makes it harder for consumers to then fight their own insurance companies after they've been flooded out of their home. I think that is nothing other than callous.
Well, if this does nothing for consumers, it's interesting because it incorporates about 90% of Ms. Velasquez's bill based upon Sandy process reform. So when you see her on the floor, you can inform her that her bill does nothing to help consumers.
I would never suggest that any bill is all bad or all good. I voted for many bills that had bad things in them. I voted against bills that have good things in them. This bill has some good things in them as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, ma'am.
Now you back.
Mr. McGovern?
I agree with Capuano.
Okay. Gentleman yields back his time.
Now, that's the kind of thoughtful member you should all take.
Well, you're winning 2-0 right now. Any other members?
Motion to close the vote.
Yeah, Gentleman Chairman Burdish.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Hensling, if you mentioned a mitigation fund as you started your presentation, and I missed the number that you said. Can you tell me what?
The bill would authorize $1 billion, which is about 28% greater than the current authorization. It would also prioritize repetitive loss properties, would go to the front of the line, and we would also change policy so they would qualify for 100% potentially of federal funding in order, again, for either flood-proofing activities, or relocation for these repetitive loss properties.
And to address the issue about building in floodplains, we do have situations in Texas where properties are developed when the municipality does not exist, and then the municipality absorbs those areas, and they're not to the standards that would have been dictated by a city government had one been in place. Gainesville, Texas, I lost 3 constituents to a flood in 2007. They were in an illegal trailer community that had just been placed on a bend on the river, and clearly was in an area that was flood prone. It will never be built on again, but unfortunately that day it was. I can just imagine that there have to be places like that existed down in Houston, Beaumont, Port Arthur, the Timber Creek neighborhoods in Louisville, Texas, Flower Mound, Texas. That creek notoriously floods over and over again. Many of the houses that were built before the city limits had gone out that far, so they were basically built in an unregulated environment. But now, certainly when possible, they have to be brought up to code, because you're correct. There are, in fact, dangerous situations that can exist.
Well, to address your point and Ms. Slaughter's point, in order for people to qualify for flood insurance, the community has to buy into essentially a floodplain management program. But this bill is not going to be a panacea, because there still are flood control projects that have to be maintained. There are certain zoning issues in flood control projects. One of the things that this bill does do, though, is go beyond current standards to make sure that local communities are addressing these repetitive loss neighborhoods, like the one I visited in Houston, 3 floods in 8 years. Again, these people are not safe. And on the other side, the taxpayer should not have to pay for the same home 5, 10, and 15 times over. And so this bill provides a combination, frankly, of carrots and sticks to help these people hopefully either flood-proof, elevate, or relocate their homes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Yes, sir. Any other members seek time? Seeing none, I want to thank both of you, not only for sticking around a couple hours this afternoon, but for your thoughtful presentation. Please make sure that you leave whatever you brought in writing for us and Stockford would be helpful, and thank you very much. By the way, if I could, without objection, entered in the record the SAP, Statement of Administrative Policy, HR 2874 from the administration. We'll enter that. Thank you very much. Okay, it looks like we've got 2 members who are seeking time. Gentleman, Mr. Green. Mr. Green, are you seeking time with the committee?
Yes.
Gentlemen, would please take this table. And the gentleman, Mr. Garrett Graves, a gentleman from Louisiana. Without objection, anything you brought in writing will be into the record. The gentleman, Mr. Green, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we have votes into my amendment came to our attention during our casework we were doing on Hurricane Harvey, that we had a number of communities in our district in the Houston area. I'm in the coastal plain. We have bios that are overrun, but the FEMA has the authority to give a grant. But if you get that grant and then they require you to continue to buy flood insurance, and some of my areas not as wealthy as others, and they're older neighborhoods, the value of the property is not that high. But what's happened is that during the years between the floods, and this neighborhood was flooded not only during Harvey, but during Hurricane Ike, and even before that in Tropical Storm Allison in 2001. But FEMA doesn't have the authority to look and see if that person could actually afford the flood insurance. And all this amendment would do is give FEMA the authority to decide, because I have casework of 2 constituents who are on Medicaid, and they've lived in the same house for decades, and it has been flooded before, but they can't afford to go anywhere else. And if they had a buyout, the property value is not high enough so they could find something comparable. So they drop their flood insurance because they need to pay for utilities, medications. These are senior citizens. And that's what I just want to give FEMA the authority to make that determination.
Thank you very much. Mr. Garrett? Mr. Graves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. First, I heard Mr. Capuano speak, and I just want to very quickly, for the record, state that not only can we live below sea level safely, we've demonstrated it. It's been demonstrated around the world. In my previous life, I actually built the levees down, helped build the levees down in New Orleans, and best protection system those folks have ever had. And we've got to figure out how to do that. 40% of our population lives in 10% of the land area in coastal areas, and we can and have had people live resiliently in those areas. Look, I agree with the bill's sponsors in regard to the objectives of this bill. Actuarial rates address program solvency, cover the debt of the program, and provide private sector alternatives and competition. Those are objectives that I agree with. However, I have significant issues with how this bill attempts to achieve it, and I think it's really important to take a step back and look at macro level. Mr. Chairman, how many disasters have we had in excess of $1 billion since 1980? Anybody, put a number in your head. There's over $1 billion disasters since 1980.
44.
We've had 218 of them, and we have spent in excess of $1.3 trillion, an average of in excess of $35 billion per year. Extraordinary number. And think about it, snowstorms, wildfires, tornadoes, earthquakes, freezes, droughts, floods, hurricanes, all sorts of different types of disasters. We are taking this one type of disaster, a flood, and attempting to address the solvency of the program. The reality is, in your home state of Texas, only 17% of the Hurricane Harvey victims had flood insurance, yet 100% of them are going to be eligible for federal assistance. Let me be clear, I agree they should be, but we're not addressing the real fundamentals of this problem. I'm a fiscal conservative. I want to ensure the solvency of this nation, the solvency of the program. This bill doesn't do it. It doesn't address the true financial problems that we're having in disasters and specifically in flood disasters. CBO's estimate said this was going to save $18 million a year in their initial estimate. Their revised estimate, I'm not sure what the latest is in the substitute amendment, said it was actually going to cost us $10 million a year. Not save, but cost for a $28 million annual change. Let me say it again. We're spending $35 billion a year on average in disasters. Why are we in the red? The GAO found that 2/3 of the premiums in some cases were being diverted, not to pay back folks who have flood claims, but being given as commissions to the folks that are selling the policies. Up to 2/3. No wonder this program's in the red. Number two, you have homes, as the chairman has stated, that have flooded 10 and 20 times, have been paid multiple times in excess of the value of the homes. That's a complete failure. I couldn't agree more. It's an oversight failure of both the Congress and I think the administrations, plural. We should be connecting the dots between programs that buy out in FEMA and USDA and others, Corps of Engineers and others, and we're failing to make that connection. One home in our district that was cited on national TV, we've actually gone and gotten USDA funds, and that home's going to be bought out. We've got to do a better job connecting these programs. GAO found that there were all sorts of administrative and bureaucratic efficiencies, and the majority of these are not being addressed.
Mr. Graves, I hate to give you the bad news, but we are
gotta
having
go
so
vote.
much fun up here. But
I
all
can
the
tell.
members here are subject to a vote at this time.
Yep.
And so what I'd like to do is we'll call timeout, subject called chair after the last vote. We're going to bring you back, back to this committee. We'll now be in recess, subject to the last vote and the call to chair.
Mr. Chairman, I have actually a tele-town hall at 7:15.
I get it, Gene. Thank you very much. Your excuse.
We were going to laud praises on you, though.
James going to be outside? Maybe. Let me look at what you're doing.
If you do, I can pass them out. Let's get it come back to order, and I want to thank the members for going to the floor and quickly coming back. Mr. Graves, I probably rudely interrupted you, and for that I would offer my apology, but the gentleman is back, and I would encourage the gentleman to start at any point that he'd like to with his testimony. The gentleman is recognized.
Pick back up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. So let me go back, and I was talking about the insolvency of the program. I agree the program's insolvent, but there are a number of reasons why, and I went through some of those. One of them, I think the third or fourth one that I've noted, is that according to FEMA's own data that I just gave Mr. Woodall, and I've got a PowerPoint presentation I'm happy to hand out to anybody, this is data that they provided to the Senate Banking Committee. You have states like Minnesota that apparently only have a 10% compliance rate. People are required to have flood insurance if you have a federally backed mortgage. 10% compliance rate. In states like Kansas and Montana, it's around 17%, and in Hawaii, around 24%. No wonder we have a solvency problem if people aren't actually paying their premiums into the program. Lastly, as an example, and certainly this isn't exhaustive, after Hurricane Katrina, the program took on approximately $16 billion worth of debt. Whenever the Corps of Engineers stood up and said it was a man-made failure, it was an engineering failure. Why are we charging ratepayers for this whenever the Corps stood up and said it was their fault? Mr. Chairman, there are, again, numerous others, but they're huge problems with the way this bill tries to address solvency. It does very little to actually bring down costs and instead tries to target actuarial rates at these inflated numbers. Now, previous speaker talked a little bit about the privatization. I just want to reiterate. One, the cherry picking issue is very concerning. Number two, private policyholders under the Ross-Kanner measure are not going to be subjected to the same fees, reserve account, and debt payments as the national flood insurance ratepayers will. So you're going to be stuck with a risk pool comprised of only high-risk folks that are also paying much higher debt. I guarantee you this Congress will be faced with addressing this insolvency problem within the next few years as a result of Ross-Kanner being included in here. I'll say it again. I agree with privatization, not under this. Lastly, let me just say this. I'll give you a hypothetical story. Let's say that John and Jane own a house in South Louisiana. Let's say that they built their house and they built a business, perhaps, in compliance with base flood elevation at the time of construction. This is a home. It's not a dynamic structure that you pick up and move around whenever conditions change. It is a home. It is a business. They build it. Let's say that as a result of the county or the parishes improper, and I say improper, but in compliance with flood insurance regulations, they're allowing folks to develop around. The water rises. It's a higher base flood elevation where John and Jane built their home. You may have $1,000 in increased premiums as a result of what the parish or county did because there truly is higher water. $1,000. They had no control over it, yet they're forced to pay it. Let's say that the state of Louisiana, as it does, another factoid for you, Mr. Woodall, we drain from Montana to 2 Canadian provinces to New York, largest watershed in the nation, one of the largest in the world, 7th largest in the world. So more water with more development is coming down in Louisiana. Let's say that $2,000 in annual premiums attributable to that. Again, our citizens did nothing. They complied with the regulations at the time. We've lost 2,000 square miles of our coast because of what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has done with our rivers. Once again, greater vulnerability. Maybe they're paying an additional $2,000, $2,500 a year for that vulnerability that's real from the coast eroding. And let's say that $500 of their premium is attributable to the inefficient bureaucracy and some of the management failures that I noted earlier. This person is perhaps paying $5,000, $6,000 a year in things they have no control over. They complied at the time. That is, in my mind, that's a tax. If you're being charged for something you have no control over and you are funding a government bureaucracy and the government's failures, that's not something that an individual homeowner, an individual business owner who complied with the regulations at the time of construction should be charged for. But that's exactly what this does. So what our amendments do, we have a number of amendments. And I'm going to be honest with you. They don't fix this bill. This bill needs fundamental reform. It needs to join together some of our Corps of Engineers, FEMA, USDA resiliency efforts. and tie them together with risk vulnerabilities. That's how you address this. There are numerous CBO reports, FEMA reports, and others that have identified this as being the best solution, the most cost-effective solution. This bill, I'm concerned, misses the mark. But again, amendments that require that NFIP premiums that are outside the confines of a homeowner or business owner's control, quantify it. Let's tell people what we're truly taxing them on. Number two, put the same debt and reserve fee on private policies as you do on public. And I want to be clear, because CBO, I think, misunderstood, or perhaps I'll take responsibility for flawed drafting. But instead of just applying the fees to the NFIP policies, apply it to the private policies as well. Create a level playing field, not to where you have a net gain in funding, to where you actually have the same level of funding you were projected to have under just the fee from the federal policies. Number 12, what it does is it prevents FEMA from increasing premiums based on things that are beyond the taxpayer's control, beyond the homeowner, the business owner's control. And it prevents any increase in premiums attributable to the things that are outside a home or business owner's ability to change. Number 13 requires FEMA to do a compliance study, going back to the chart, the table that I held up, simply makes them go back and look at the uptake rates or the mandatory participation rates in these various states. Before you change people's rates, figure out who's not paying right now. Let's address this problem. Then figure out what your actuarial rate increases need to be. Last one is to quantify the amount of equity or value that a homeowner or a business owner has lost as a result of this program. Because it does devalue homes whenever your flood insurance rates spike. It takes money directly away from what you're able to pay for a mortgage. And so that's what our amendments do. I'll say that they don't fix the fundamental problems with the bill, but it highlights some of the concerns that are out there, and I think that's important for taxpayers and ratepayers to know background on these costs. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Let the record reflect the gentleman, Mr. Green, was asked, and I consented that he did not have to reappear after we came back. And I want to thank Mr. Green. Mr. Graves, thank you very much. Ms. Slaughter.
Oh, I don't have any questions, Mr. Graves, because I got here late, but it looked to me like you've done a good bit of work on this. I'm concerned about this bill as well, to make sure we're going in the right direction. I hope your amendments will be made in order.
Thank you.
Judge Hastings?
Mr. Chairman, I support making Mr. Graves' amendments in order.
Thank you very much. Mr. Woodall? No question. Gentleman does not seek time. Dr. Burgess does not seek time. Mr. Collins does not seek time. Mr. Byrne does not seek time. The gentleman from the state of Washington, the gentleman does not seek time, does not seek time. The gentleman from Windsor, Colorado does not seek time. Thank you very much. Mr. Graves, the study that you have done and put into this is to be commended. You and your state, including your background in your state, this is a backbone of not only money the federal government gives and participates in, but your state needs a program that properly works, but has done so not to offer anyone the heartburn of year after year after year having these properties to be paid for. I applaud you for your resiliency to come up here. I applaud you for your hard work, and I will study not only what you brought, but want to look at it later. But I appreciate your time today, and the gentleman has done very well. And I appreciate you taking time to get us before you to hear you today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll leave copies of these PowerPoints should you care to look at them.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Is there another member that would seek to provide testimony to the Rules Committee HR 2874, 21st Century Flood Reform Act? Seeing none, this now closes the hearing portion of HR 2874. And the chairman now be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman, distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant HR 2874, the 21st Century Flood Reform Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, modified by the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for the consideration of the conference report to accompany H.R. 2810, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. The rule waives all points of order against the conference report and against its consideration. The rule provides that the conference report shall be considered as read. The rule provides that the previous question shall be considered as ordered without intervention of any motion except 1 hour of debate and 1 motion to recommit if applicable. Finally, Section 3 of the rule provides that the clerk shall not transmit to the Senate a message that the House has adopted the conference report to accompany H.R. 2810 until notified by the Speaker or by message from the Senate that the Senate has passed H.R. 4374 without amendment.
Thank you very much. I yield myself just for a brief conversation. This is one rule, two measures, so that we understand this is conference report rule, 1 hour debate. HASC, MTR, if they choose, instructs the clerk not to transmit the conference report until the Senate passage of H.R. 4374. This is in discussion with exactly what the gentlewoman from New York spoke about.
This is the FDA issue?
This is the FDA issue, that Section 730.
And the Senate's not agreed?
Well, it's allowing them where we're not going to pass this
We're not
back.
going to send
We're
it
not
over
gonna
till they
complete the
do.
paperwork till they do that. We've asked them to do that.
And they know that?
They are very, if not, they will be aware tonight.
All right.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
This is a bit weird or something that I've not seen before. Is there precedent for this kind of undertaking in the rules? I'm just
Is this allowed
curious.
in the rules of the House?
That we hold it and not transmit it?
But you write in the rule that you're not going to send it over till they pass it. I mean, is that?
Well, let me
allowed
put
to
it this
do
way.
that?
We're trying to deal with an issue, and the gentleman knows that what happened in this case was the Senate did not concur. And so we negotiated as best as we could, including the gentleman, Dr. Michael Burgess of this Rules Committee, on behalf of the Rules Committee, on behalf of the Energy and Commerce Committee as Subcommittee Chairman for Health. The gentleman, Mr. Walden, joined in, the Chairman of the committee, and this was the best we could do. Yes, we do hold things at the desk until there are other agreements.
I don't think you write it in the bill rule. But anyway,
Well,
what happens if they don't do it?
Well,
Does NDAA just go down then?
we're hoping that they choose to accept the language that we have provided back. You know what?
I'm kind of anxious to see how it works.
Well, let's put it this
Okay,
way.
yeah.
The ranking member and the chairman of this committee felt strongly about what we did. While I had very little to do with it, I went over and argued myself. I spent a good bit of one afternoon doing that. I talked to Mr. McCain, his chief of staff. I talked to the staff director. I talked to their subject matter expert. I went and took the fire to them, and they chose not to do something. So we're trying to put back our prerogative.
I understand they don't want to do it because they don't want to take the prerogative away from the FDA.
Well, it's a number of issues. I think what they want to do is move forward. This is an agreement whereby the FDA came in. Yes, ma'am. I think my concerns were very much along your line also. So, yes, sir, it probably is not very often, but I consider this a positive move, and I hope you do too.
Well, I'm just curious about it.
It raises questions.
Sure, all right.
So well, that's what our position is.
All right.
Okay. Is there amendment or discussion to this?
Yes, I do.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 2874 an open rule so that all members have the opportunity to offer amendments to the bill on the floor.
Thank you very much. Discussion? We've heard vigorous discussions today about ideas and issues, and so the gentlewoman is noting these great discussions where there is not agreement with the bill. Thank you very much. All right, the vote will now be on the Slaughter Amendment. Those in favor of the Slaughter Amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
I need roll
Those have
call.
gentlewoman, that's a roll call vote. The clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Burns? No. Mr. Burns, no. Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck? No. Mr. Buck, no. Ms. Cheney? No. Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter?
Yes.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern? Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
2 yeas, 8 nays.
The motion's not agreed to, motion's not agreed to, amendment's not agreed to, further amendment or discussion. Vote will now be on the motion from the gentleman, distinguished gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it.
Well, I guess we
Gentlewoman,
want a roll call. Roll call.
Gentlewoman asked for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck? Aye. Mr. Buck, aye. Miss Cheney? Aye. Miss Cheney, aye. Miss Slaughter?
No.
Miss Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern? Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
8 yeas, 2 nays.
Motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman, Mr. Byrne, distinguished gentleman from Alabama, will be handling this for Republicans.
And I will do Democrats.
And Mrs. Slaughter will be handling this for Democrats. I need to announce that on Wednesday at noon, high noon, we'll be handling a tax bill called H.R. 1 that will be before the committee.
Could I comment on that?
Yes, ma'am.
According to the Hill, the score on that from CBO will not be ready. I really think something of this magnitude and the what it's going to do, you know, we need to know exactly what the effect is going to be on the economy. Because there's some new things in here that we have not really tried before to add to the deficit. So we, at least I think the two of us want to object that we would go ahead with that without the CBO score.
You know, thank you. I don't know exactly what I'm talking about, but it's my understanding that under these bills that are reconciliation, the joint tax is the one that handles that official answer.
That's the official answer?
I believe it is, but I will have an answer for you, and I'll catch you on the phone tomorrow, but that's my understanding.
Was it joint tax?
That's a joint tax.
They have given out a report?
In my opinion, joint tax. I don't know that they have not looked at any revision that took place, but I will stand corrected and admit I was wrong if I provided you wrong, poorly developed information. But it's my understanding that what is required is a joint tax. Perhaps the gentleman would have better information, the gentleman from Florida.
I do not have any better information than you would, Mr. Chairman, save the fact that some analysis evidently is going to be done. There's going to be some determination as to what the costs are. And Ms. Slaughter has expressed my sentiments. I spoke earlier. I think we are rushing to satisfy political requirements, which is the prerogative of the majority. But the potential unintended consequences are going to be magnified as opposed to ordinary legislation that others had input to. And that's my take on it.
I am not making the announcement, but it was my understanding that they did present a score. It was spoken about at the time we have been through the hearing today in some perception.
We don't have a copy of it.
But are you talking about what added to the deficit?
Tax.
I am saying that.
Yeah, it's 1.7.
I heard 1.5.
Yeah, 1.7 was the latest.
Okay, there might be. See, you might, and I'm willing to admit I may not have.
I think we've got it.
Oh,
Ms.
okay.
Purdue here tells me that CBO is waiting on the joint tax for the data to do their analysis on economic impact.
Okay, well,
So we don't have either joint tax or a CBO.
What I do know is that joint tax issued a 1.5 or 1.7 figure, and that was alluded to today, and I will be honest with you, subject to change, and my
Well, it's a work in progress.
Well, I did view it that way. I just did not know there could have been new things. I know.
You know, Mr. Chairman, what's fascinating, everybody sees this, it's pretty transparent, and all these deficit people the deficit be done until we get this done, and then you'll be back to square one. And where I fear there's language in here that talks about added costs, and what we will be back here doing is addressing Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. And if that's the objective, then you're going to find a lot of resistance along the way. That's all I'm.
Well, Jeffrey Sachs said this morning that
I saw him on MSNBC or CNN.
And he said if we do the $1.4 trillion, we'll go bankrupt.
Well,
I'd love to have some assurance that's not going to happen.
As best I can tell you, the gentleman's entitled to his own opinion. And if you'd like to debate that on Wednesday, I'm willing to debate that. But I will just tell you that I thought some of his comments did not meet the panel, who was short, that they just said thank you very much. He was most strident in his enunciation as an economist and his view. One woman offered some bit of balance, I thought, to that. But I tried to watch it objectively, and I want you to know that I saw what you saw.
Good. Well, I think we just would object to going on with it without scores. I mean, this is.
Okay. Now, I've just been advised by a gentlewoman that from our number 2 person here on the staff, and Karis has advised me that joint tax has a score up on their website.
Good. Okay.
So I believe that was.
So then CBO has it as well, I'm sure.
I would believe that CBO can then come in and check their mathematics anytime they choose.
Okay.
But that's what I think is the status. Did I get that right, Karis?
The deficit.
Okay.
So this is.
We don't know about CBO. We don't know about joint tax.
All right.
Well, we're trying to answer your questions as fairly as possible. Yes, sir.
I was only going to point out that CBO is not tasked with scoring this except to perform the dynamic scoring that we've asked them to do in addition. I think, folks, there was some reluctance to do dynamic scoring at all, but that's the only thing we'll be missing, the JCT report.
It's going to be fun.
And the JCT does not, joint tax does not use anything but just static scoring. All right, are there any other questions from the committee? I want to recognize that we have my former legislative director, gentleman, Mr. Tucker Anderson, a lawyer from Dallas, Texas, who has taken time to grace us with his presence all afternoon. Mr. Anderson, thank you very much for doing this. We hope it was worth your time. Is there any other comment or information that the committee needs to look at this time? Seeing none, we've now completed our work for the day.
Louise, are those your Auburn University glasses and glasses case there? Is this